Ethan Walker had spent 5 years fighting a battle he was slowly losing. Ever since his wife died, the aircraft maintenance technician had worked every overtime shift he could find, skipped meals, sold possessions, and sacrificed nearly everything to keep a roof over his 10-year-old daughter Sophie's head. But on a cold, stormy night in Montana, all those sacrifices seemed meaningless as he stood in his kitchen staring at a final foreclosure notice. The bank had given him 30 days. 30 days before they took the only home his daughter had left, the home filled with memories of her mother, the home Ethan had promised he would never let go. He folded the letter with trembling hands, trying to hide his fear from Sophie, when a sudden roar exploded across the sky. The windows rattled. The lights flickered. Ethan rushed outside and looked up just in time to see a private jet spiraling through the darkness, one engine engulfed in flames. The aircraft cut through the storm clouds like a dying star before disappearing beyond the forest ridge. Seconds later, a massive explosion shook the valley. Without thinking, Ethan jumped into his truck and raced toward the crash site. Rain hammered the windshield as sirens echoed in the distance. When he arrived, the scene looked like something from a nightmare. Twisted metal burned across the mountainside. Fire spread through the trees. Debris littered the ground. Most people would have waited for rescue crews. Ethan ran directly into the flames. Then he heard a weak cry for help buried beneath the wreckage. Ignoring the heat scorching his skin, he climbed over shattered steel and burning debris until he found her. A young woman, stunning even through the blood and smoke, was trapped beneath a collapsed section of the cabin. Her pulse was fading. The fire was closing in. With every second counting, Ethan forced the metal aside, lifted her onto his shoulders, and staggered through the inferno. The moment he reached safety, the aircraft erupted behind him in a violent fireball that turned night into day. Doctors later called her survival impossible. The news called Ethan a hero. But neither knew the truth. The woman he had saved was Olivia Bennett, a wealthy investor with powerful enemies and secrets worth millions. Days later, while Ethan faced eviction from the predatory bank, determined to seize his home, Olivia would uncover a shocking connection between that bank, a decades-long financial conspiracy, and Ethan's own tragic past. And in a twist, no one could have imagined the stranger whose life he saved would soon become the owner of the very bank trying to destroy his. Ethan Walker had never imagined that the hardest part of losing his wife would come years after her funeral. The grief had been unbearable in the beginning, but grief eventually became something familiar, a scar he carried quietly every day. What never became easier was watching his daughter grow up without her mother. Every morning he packed Sophie's lunch, braided her hair the best he could, drove her to school, worked long shifts at the regional airport, and returned home exhausted, only to repeat the process again. The little cabin on the edge of town was far from perfect. The roof leaked during heavy storms. The porch sagged slightly on one side. The paint was peeling. Yet to Ethan and Sophie it was everything. It was where Rachel had laughed while baking apple pies. It was where Sophie had taken her first steps. It was where Ethan still sat alone some nights, staring at old photographs when his daughter was asleep. Losing that house would feel like losing Rachel all over again. Unfortunately, the numbers did not care about memories. Bills piled up month after month. Medical expenses from Rachel's illness had drained their savings years ago. Interest accumulated. Loan payments became harder to make. Ethan took every extra shift available, but it never seemed enough. The foreclosure notice lying on the kitchen counter felt less like a legal document and more like a death sentence. Earlier that evening, he had carefully folded it and slipped it into a drawer before Sophie could see it. He hated lying to his daughter, but he hated seeing fear in her eyes even more. After dinner, Sophie sat beside him at the small wooden table, coloring a picture for school. "Dad?" she asked softly. Ethan looked up from the stack of unpaid bills. "Yeah, sweetheart." She hesitated. "Do you think Mom can still see us?" The question struck him harder than any debt collector ever could. Ethan swallowed and forced a smile. "I think she can." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. Then she probably knows you're trying really hard. Ethan felt his throat tighten. Maybe she does. Sophie slid her drawing across the table. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands in front of the cabin. Rachel was drawn larger than the others with bright yellow hair and a giant smile. Above them she had written, "Our family forever." Ethan stared at the picture for several seconds before pulling his daughter into a hug. He held her a little longer than usual that night. Neither of them knew how much their lives were about to change. Hours later, the storm arrived. Rain hammered against the cabin roof. Wind howled through the trees surrounding the property. Ethan couldn't sleep. Foreclosure notices had a way of stealing sleep from people. He sat in the living room staring at the dark window, wondering how he would explain everything to Sophie if they lost the house. He was still sitting there when the explosion came. At first he thought lightning had struck nearby. The sound was deafening. The entire cabin trembled. Then came a second roar, much louder than thunder. Ethan rushed outside. Cold rain immediately soaked through his clothes. He looked toward the sky and froze. High above the mountains, a streak of fire was falling through the darkness. A private jet spiraled wildly, one wing engulfed in flames. The aircraft seemed almost suspended in time for a brief moment before gravity took over. Then it plunged behind the forest ridge. A massive fireball erupted moments later, illuminating the entire valley. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. There was no time to think, no time to hesitate. He sprinted back inside, grabbed his truck keys, and raced toward the crash site. The roads were slick and dangerous. Rain reduced visibility to almost nothing, yet he drove faster than he ever had before. Emergency sirens echoed somewhere in the distance, but he knew rescue teams would take precious minutes to reach the remote mountainside. Minutes people inside that aircraft might not have. By the time Ethan arrived, the scene resembled a war zone. Burning debris littered the forest. Trees had been uprooted. Pieces of twisted metal were scattered across hundreds of yards. Flames danced through the rain, fed by leaking fuel. The heat was so intense he could feel it from dozens of feet away. Several locals had already gathered nearby, but nobody was moving toward the wreckage. They stood frozen, horrified by what they were seeing. Ethan understood why. Any sane person would stay back. The aircraft could explode again at any moment. But then he heard something, a sound so faint he almost missed it. A cry, weak, desperate, human. Ethan's eyes widened. Someone was alive. Without a second thought, he ran directly toward the wreckage. People shouted for him to stop. He ignored them. Flames licked at his clothes as he climbed over broken sections of fuselage. Smoke burned his lungs. Every breath felt like inhaling knives. The wreckage groaned and shifted beneath him. Another explosion erupted somewhere behind him, showering sparks into the night. Still, he continued searching. Then, he found her. A young woman lay trapped beneath a collapsed section of the aircraft cabin. Blood streaked across her forehead. Dark hair clung to her face. Her eyes were closed. One arm was pinned beneath twisted metal. Even through the dirt, blood, and smoke, Ethan could tell she was strikingly beautiful. More importantly, she was alive. Barely. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse weak. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her. "Hey!" he shouted over the crackling flames. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered slightly. For a brief second, pale blue eyes opened and met his. Fear, confusion, pain. He saw all of it in that single glance. Then her eyes closed again. The metal trapping her weighed hundreds of pounds. Ethan pulled with everything he had. Nothing happened. He repositioned himself and tried again. His muscles screamed in protest. Rain mixed with sweat across his face. The wreckage shifted slightly, but not enough. Another explosion rocked the aircraft. Fire surged closer. Ethan glanced around. Every instinct told him he was running out of time. He thought about Sophie sleeping safely at home. He thought about Rachel. He thought about how he would never forgive himself if he walked away while someone still had a chance to live. With a roar of determination, he planted his feet and pulled harder than he ever had in his life. Something gave way. The metal lifted just enough. Ethan reached down, grabbed the unconscious woman, and dragged her free. The effort nearly collapsed him. But there was no time to rest. The flames were spreading rapidly. Fuel continued leaking across the ground. Carrying the woman over his shoulder, Ethan began navigating the burning wreckage. Every step felt heavier than the last. The heat was unbearable. Smoke blurred his vision. At one point, he stumbled and nearly fell. Somehow, he kept moving, 20 feet, 30 feet, 40 feet. Then, the night exploded. A massive fireball erupted from the center of the aircraft. The shockwave threw Ethan forward. He hit the ground hard, still clutching the woman protectively. Burning debris rained around them. For several seconds, he could hear nothing but ringing in his ears. When he finally looked up, the entire wreckage was engulfed in flames. If he had been even a few seconds slower, both of them would have died. Paramedics arrived shortly afterward. As they loaded the woman onto a stretcher, one of the emergency responders turned toward Ethan. "You pulled her out of there." Ethan nodded weakly. The paramedic stared at the inferno behind them. "That's impossible." Ethan looked at the unconscious stranger as they wheeled her toward the ambulance. Her face seemed peaceful now, despite the chaos surrounding them. He didn't know her name. He didn't know where she came from. He didn't know why she had been on that plane. He only knew that she was alive. As the ambulance doors closed, her hand slipped from beneath the blanket. For reasons he couldn't explain, Ethan reached out and gently squeezed it. Her fingers twitched in response. It lasted only a moment, but something about it stayed with him. A connection formed in the middle of disaster. Not romance, not destiny, just two strangers whose lives had collided in the darkest possible circumstances. Ethan watched the ambulance disappear into the storm before finally turning toward home. He thought the story would end there. A man saves a stranger survives. Life moves on. That was what everyone in town would eventually believe. None of them knew that the woman sleeping inside that ambulance carried secrets powerful enough to shake an entire financial empire. None of them knew that her survival would soon become deeply intertwined with Ethan's fight to save his home, protect his daughter, and uncover truths buried for years. For now, however, Ethan was simply a tired father walking back to his truck beneath the rain, unaware that the most important chapter of his life had only just begun. The days following the plane crash passed in a strange blur for Ethan Walker. The town treated him like a hero. Local newspapers published photographs of the burning wreckage alongside headlines praising his courage. People stopped him at the grocery store to shake his hand. Co-workers at the airport bought him coffee and slapped him on the back. Yet none of it changed the reality waiting for him at home every night. Hero or not, he was still behind on his mortgage. Hero or not, the bank still wanted his house. Hero or not, he still woke up every morning wondering how he was going to protect the only family he had left. 3 days after the crash, Ethan arrived home after a 12-hour shift and immediately sensed something was wrong. The front door was slightly open. Panic surged through him. "Sophie!" he shouted as he rushed inside. He found his daughter sitting at the kitchen table with tears in her eyes. In front of her lay an envelope bearing the logo of Iron Gate Financial. Ethan's stomach dropped. He had hidden every foreclosure notice, every overdue statement, every threatening letter. But somehow this one had arrived while he was at work. Sophie looked up at him, her face pale. "Dad, are they taking our house?" The question struck harder than any punch. Ethan slowly sat beside her. For a long moment he couldn't find the words. Sophie pushed the letter toward him. Her small hands trembled. "I read it," she whispered. "It says we have to leave." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. There was no way to soften the truth anymore. "Sweetheart, are we going to be homeless?" she interrupted. The fear in her voice shattered him. Sophie wasn't worried about toys or school or friends. She was worried about losing the place where her mother had lived, the place where she still felt closest to her. Ethan pulled her into his arms as tears rolled down her cheeks. "Listen to me," he said softly. "I don't know what's going to happen yet, but I promise you one thing. I'm going to fight for this house until my last breath." Sophie buried her face against his chest. "Mom loved this house." Ethan stared toward the hallway where family photographs hung on the wall. "I know." That night, neither of them slept much. Sophie eventually fell asleep on the couch, clutching one of Rachel's old sweaters. Ethan remained awake, staring at the foreclosure notice. Final notice. Vacate within 30 days. The words seemed burned into his mind. What angered him most wasn't just the debt. It was how quickly the bank had turned cold. For years, he had made payments despite impossible circumstances. He had explained his situation repeatedly. Medical bills, loss of income after Rachel's death, unexpected expenses. None of it mattered. Iron Gate Financial treated him like a number instead of a human being. The following morning, Ethan decided to visit the local branch one final time. Perhaps there was still a chance to negotiate. Perhaps someone would listen. The bank manager, Richard Coleman, greeted him with a smile that felt rehearsed. Ethan sat across from the polished desk and explained everything again. Sophie, Rachel, the overtime shifts, the efforts he had made. Coleman listened politely before folding his hands. "Mr. Walker, I'm afraid the decision is final." Ethan struggled to remain calm. "I've never stopped paying. I fell behind after my wife died, that's all. The account no longer meets our lending requirements. Then let me refinance. Request denied. Give me 6 months. Denied. 3 months. Denied." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You don't even have to think about it, do you?" Coleman looked away. "The decision comes from higher levels." Ethan stood. "People like you sit behind desks and call it business. For me, it's my daughter's home." The manager remained silent. Ethan walked out before his anger exploded. As he left, he noticed several elderly residents waiting in the lobby. One woman clutched paperwork with tears in her eyes. Another man argued quietly with a loan officer. Their expressions looked hauntingly familiar. Fear, defeat, hopelessness. For the first time, Ethan began wondering how many others were experiencing the same nightmare. Meanwhile, several miles away, Olivia Bennett opened her eyes inside a hospital room. Recovery had been slow. Multiple fractures, concussion symptoms, endless tests. Yet her mind remained sharp enough to remember fragments of what had happened before the crash. She remembered meetings, documents, financial records, a name, Iron Gate Financial. The memory returned suddenly while she watched a news report on the television mounted in her hospital room. The broadcast showed a segment about Ethan Walker, the man who had saved her life. Olivia listened carefully as the reporter discussed his background. Then a single sentence caught her attention. Sources confirm Walker is currently facing foreclosure proceedings initiated by Iron Gate Financial. Olivia sat upright despite the pain shooting through her ribs. Iron Gate Financial. Her heartbeat quickened. That name was not unfamiliar. Before the crash, she had spent nearly 8 months conducting a private investigation into the company. Publicly, Iron Gate appeared successful. Privately, Olivia's analysts had uncovered disturbing patterns. Hundreds of foreclosures concentrated in struggling communities, aggressive lending practices, unusual profit spikes linked to property seizures. The evidence had been incomplete but enough to attract her attention. She had been traveling to meet a confidential source when the plane crashed. Olivia reached for her phone. Most of her business contacts had been trying to reach her for days. One call connected immediately. "Olivia!" a voice exclaimed. "Thank God you're alive." "Michael," she said, "I need everything we have on Iron Gate." There was silence. Right now, right now. Within hours, encrypted files began arriving. Olivia spent the afternoon reviewing reports. The more she read, the more disturbed she became. Foreclosure rates far exceeded industry averages. Loan modifications were frequently denied even when borrowers qualified. Internal audits contained unexplained discrepancies. Several whistleblowers had disappeared from public view after raising concerns. Then she found something even stranger. One report listed dozens of homeowners whose debts had increased unexpectedly despite regular payments. Ethan Walker's name appeared among them. Olivia frowned. She opened the file. Payment records, penalty fees, interest adjustments, legal notices. The numbers didn't make sense. Certain charges appeared duplicated, others lacked authorization. The account history contained irregularities that should never have passed compliance review. A chill moved down her spine. She wasn't looking at simple negligence. She was looking at something deliberate. Later that evening, Ethan stopped by the hospital to check on her. He had visited twice before, mostly because he wanted to ensure she was recovering. He still knew very little about her. Olivia greeted him with a warm smile. "You're becoming a regular visitor." Ethan shrugged awkwardly. "Just making sure you're okay." "I owe you my life." "You don't owe me anything." Olivia studied him carefully. The exhaustion in his face was impossible to miss. Dark circles beneath his eyes, shoulders weighed down by stress, a man carrying burdens he never talked about. "The news mentioned your house." Ethan's smile faded instantly. "Yeah." Olivia hesitated. "How bad is it?" Ethan laughed bitterly. 30 days. Olivia remained silent. "I don't want sympathy," Ethan added. "I've got enough problems already." "What if the bank made a mistake?" she asked. Ethan shook his head. "Banks don't make mistakes when they're taking things from people." The statement lingered in the room after he left. Olivia stared at the documents on her bedside table. She had survived a plane crash because Ethan Walker refused to abandon a stranger. Now she was beginning to suspect that stranger had been investigating the very institution threatening to destroy his life. Over the next week, more warning signs emerged. Olivia's legal team uncovered lawsuits quietly settled out of court. Former employees described pressure to maximize foreclosures regardless of circumstances. Internal communications referenced targets tied directly to property acquisitions. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Irongate wasn't merely lending money. It appeared to be systematically positioning itself to seize valuable real estate from vulnerable families. Ethan's case was no longer an isolated tragedy. It was one example among many. The emotional center of the story shifted. What began as gratitude toward a heroic father transformed into outrage. Olivia found herself thinking less about her own recovery and more about Sophie sitting terrified in that cabin. She imagined the little girl losing the home where her mother had lived. She imagined dozens of other families experiencing the same thing. Every new document deepened her anger. Every new inconsistency strengthened her resolve. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Buried inside a collection of archived financial records was evidence suggesting certain mortgage accounts had been altered after origination. Not dozens, hundreds. Ethan Walker's file appeared among them. Olivia stared at the screen for several seconds. Someone had manipulated numbers. Someone had increased liabilities. Someone inside Irongate had created conditions designed to push borrowers toward foreclosure. Her pulse quickened. This was no longer a suspicion. It was the beginning of proof. Looking out the hospital window toward the distant mountains, Olivia made a silent promise. She had survived the crash for a reason. Ethan had risked his life to save hers. And if Irongate Financial truly was destroying innocent families for profit, she would uncover the truth no matter how powerful the people behind it might be. Neither she nor Ethan realized it yet, but the battle ahead was about to become far larger than a single house. It was becoming a fight against an entire system built on greed, deception, and the suffering of people who believed the rules were fair. and for the first time since the crash, Olivia Bennet stopped seeing herself as a survivor. She began seeing herself as someone preparing for war. The deeper Olivia Bennet dug into Iron Gate Financial, the darker the story became. What had initially appeared to be a ruthless lending institution now looked increasingly like a machine designed to manufacture foreclosures. 2 weeks after leaving the hospital, Olivia rented a small office in town and assembled a team of attorneys, forensic accountants, and investigators she trusted. Ethan had never imagined himself working alongside corporate lawyers and financial analysts, but every day after finishing his shift at the airport, he found himself sitting across from Olivia at a conference table covered with documents. At first, he participated only because his own home was at risk. Soon, however, he realized his situation was only one thread in something much larger. The files they reviewed revealed family after family who had lost homes under suspicious circumstances. Elderly couples who had never missed payments suddenly faced mysterious penalties. Veterans returning from deployment discovered loan modifications had vanished from records. Single parents found interest rates altered without notification. Every story carried the same theme. The victims struggled. Iron Gate profited. One afternoon, Olivia projected a map onto a large screen. Red markers covered entire regions across 3 states. These are confirmed foreclosures linked to unusual account activity, she explained. Ethan stared at the display. There were hundreds. How did nobody stop this? He asked quietly. Olivia folded her arms. Because every individual case looked isolated. Nobody connected them. Ethan's jaw tightened. Until now. As the investigation expanded, so did public fear. Several former Iron Gate employees agreed to speak anonymously. Most were terrified. One former loan processor described direct orders from senior management to reject hardship applications regardless of eligibility. Another claimed internal software had been modified to generate additional fees automatically. A retired accountant admitted she had witnessed account adjustments she could never explain. Yet whenever Olivia requested sworn testimony, witnesses suddenly backed out. Some stopped answering calls entirely. Others claimed they had changed their minds. The pattern disturbed her. Someone was actively protecting Iron Gate. Then came the first real breakthrough. One evening, Ethan returned home to find Sophie sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by old cardboard boxes. The young girl looked up as he entered. "I was looking for Mom's photo albums," she said. Ethan smiled weakly. "Find anything good?" Sophie nodded and held up a faded notebook. "I found this in the garage." Ethan froze. The notebook belonged to Rachel. He immediately recognized her handwriting. His late wife had always filled journals with notes, reminders, and observations. Most contained ordinary details about family life. This one was different. The moment Ethan opened it, his expression changed. Page after page contained financial figures, account numbers, names, and handwritten comments. Rachel had been investigating something. His pulse quickened. He carried the notebook directly to Olivia's office. She spent nearly an hour reviewing its contents in complete silence. Finally, she looked up. "Ethan." Her voice had changed. "What is it?" Olivia slowly turned the notebook toward him. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the pages: Iron Gate Financial. Ethan felt the room spin. Rachel had worked as a freelance bookkeeping consultant before her death. He knew she occasionally handled financial records for local businesses, but she had never mentioned investigating a bank. Olivia continued reading. "These aren't casual notes. She was documenting irregular transactions." Ethan stared at his wife's handwriting. Notes filled the margins: missing records, unauthorized transfers, loan manipulation, hidden accounts. Rachel had uncovered evidence years before anyone else. "Why didn't she tell me?" he whispered. Olivia didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned to the final pages. The entries became increasingly urgent. Rachel had written about feeling watched. about receiving strange phone calls, about someone following her vehicle. Then came the final entry, 3 days before her fatal car accident. Ethan read the words twice before he fully understood them. If anything happens to me, someone needs to know what they're doing. Silence filled the room. Ethan felt as though the air had vanished from his lungs. For 5 years, he had accepted Rachel's death as a tragic accident. She had lost control of her vehicle during heavy rain on a mountain road. The police investigation had found nothing suspicious. Case closed. But now, doubt entered his mind for the first time. Olivia looked at him carefully. "When exactly did Rachel die?" Ethan told her the date. Olivia immediately opened another file. After several moments, she found what she was searching for. Her face paled. "Ethan, look at this." The document showed internal Iron Gate communications obtained from a former employee. The dates matched the week before Rachel's death. One executive referenced a local contractor who had become a potential liability. No name appeared. No direct accusation existed. Yet the timing was impossible to ignore. Ethan felt anger unlike anything he had ever experienced. For years he had mourned his wife. For years he had blamed fate. Now he was being forced to consider a possibility so horrifying he could barely process it. What if Rachel had died because she got too close to the truth? That question changed everything. The investigation was no longer about a house. It was no longer about foreclosure. It had become personal. From that moment forward, Ethan dedicated himself completely to exposing Iron Gate. Unfortunately, Iron Gate noticed. The first warning arrived 3 days later. Ethan left work after a late shift and discovered all 4 tires on his truck had been slashed. No witnesses, no surveillance footage, just a folded piece of paper tucked beneath the windshield wiper. "Stop digging." Ethan stared at the message for several seconds. He showed it to Olivia immediately. "This isn't random anymore," she said. Ethan nodded. "I know." The second warning came a week later. Sophie answered the house phone while Ethan was outside repairing a fence. He returned to find his daughter pale and shaking. "Who called?" he asked. Sophie swallowed hard. "A man." Ethan knelt beside her. "What did he say?" Tears filled her eyes. "He asked if I liked living in the cabin." Rage exploded inside Ethan. Whoever was behind this had crossed a line. Sophie was no longer off limits. That night he barely slept. Every sound outside sent him to the window. Every passing vehicle made him tense. The feeling of being watched became impossible to ignore. Several times he noticed the same black SUV parked near the airport. Once he saw it parked near Sophie's school. When he approached it, immediately drove away. Olivia experienced similar pressure. Anonymous emails flooded her inbox. Threats disguised as warnings. Investors suddenly withdrew from unrelated projects. A private investigator working for her team reported being followed. Someone with considerable resources wanted the investigation buried. Instead of frightening Olivia, it strengthened her resolve. "They're making mistakes," she told Ethan one evening. "People only panic when they have something to hide." By then, the relationship between them had evolved into something neither fully understood. It wasn't simply gratitude anymore. Long hours spent working together created a deeper connection. Olivia admired Ethan's quiet strength, his devotion to Sophie, and his refusal to quit despite overwhelming odds. Ethan admired Olivia's intelligence, determination, and willingness to fight for strangers she barely knew. Neither openly discussed their growing feelings. Both carried emotional scars. Ethan still loved the memory of Rachel. Olivia spent years prioritizing business over relationships. Yet moments emerged unexpectedly. Shared coffee during late-night meetings. Conversations about childhood dreams. Quiet laughter amid endless stress. One evening, Sophie entered Olivia's office carrying a drawing. "I made this for you." Olivia smiled as she accepted the paper. The drawing showed 3 people standing together in front of a cabin. Ethan, Sophie, Olivia. Above them, Sophie had written one simple word: family. For a moment, nobody spoke. Ethan glanced away awkwardly. Olivia's eyes became suspiciously bright. Sophie grinned innocently, unaware of the emotions she had just stirred. As winter approached, the investigation reached a critical stage. Olivia's team finally uncovered evidence, proving mortgage data had been altered systematically across hundreds of accounts. The findings were explosive, but before they could present them publicly, disaster struck. One night, Ethan returned home and found the cabin door wide open. Panic surged through him. He rushed inside, calling Sophie's name. Fortunately, she was safe. She had been staying with a neighbor after school, but the house had been ransacked. Drawers emptied, boxes overturned, papers scattered everywhere. Someone had searched the property. Ethan immediately noticed what was missing: Rachel's notebook. The evidence linking her to the investigation had vanished. Olivia arrived minutes later. The sight of the destroyed home left her speechless. Ethan stood in the center of the living room, staring at the chaos. "They're scared," he said quietly. Olivia looked at him. "What?" Ethan's eyes hardened. "They're terrified we're getting close." For the first time since Rachel's death, he felt certain of one thing: the accident that took his wife, the threats against his daughter, the missing evidence. The corrupted mortgages, none of it existed in isolation. It was all connected. Somewhere inside Iron Gate Financial, powerful people were hiding a secret worth protecting at any cost. And now Ethan Walker and Olivia Bennett had become their biggest threat. As snow began falling outside the shattered cabin windows, both understood that the battle ahead would be more dangerous than anything they had faced so far. The past and present had finally collided. The truth was closer than ever, and the closer they came to uncovering it, the more desperate their enemies became. The end came so quietly that Ethan Walker almost didn't believe it at first. After months of threats, sleepless nights, buried secrets, and battles against people far more powerful than himself, the headline appeared on every television screen in America: Bennett Capital acquires Iron Gate Financial. Inside a crowded conference room packed with reporters, executives, and federal investigators, Olivia Bennett stood at the head of the table and delivered the announcement that would change countless lives. Every piece of evidence her team had uncovered was handed over to authorities. The fraudulent mortgage schemes, the manipulated loan records, the hidden accounts, the intimidation of witnesses, and the network of executives who had built fortunes by stealing homes from struggling families were exposed for the world to see. Within days, arrests followed. Several senior executives were led away in handcuffs. Federal investigations expanded across multiple states. Hundreds of foreclosure cases were reopened. Families who had spent years believing they had been powerless finally received justice. Among them was Ethan. A complete audit of his mortgage revealed exactly what Olivia had suspected from the beginning. Unauthorized fees, altered records, and fabricated penalties had inflated his debt far beyond what he actually owed. The foreclosure order was immediately canceled. The house was his again, the home Rachel had loved, the home Sophie had fought so hard to keep. Yet the most emotional moment came several weeks later when investigators uncovered enough evidence to officially reopen Rachel Walker's case. Though they could never prove every detail of what happened years ago, the investigation confirmed that Rachel had indeed been gathering evidence against Iron Gate before her death. Her warnings had been real. Her fears had been justified. The woman Ethan had mourned for 5 long years was finally recognized not as a victim of circumstance, but as someone brave enough to stand against corruption when few others would. On a quiet spring afternoon, Ethan and Sophie stood together beside Rachel's grave. The mountains were green again. The snow had melted. Ethan placed a bouquet of white lilies beside the headstone and smiled through tears. "You were right all along," he whispered, "and we finally finished what you started." When they returned home, they found Olivia sitting on the porch swing Sophie had painted the previous weekend. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Sophie ran forward and wrapped her arms around Olivia. It felt natural, effortless, like something that had been missing for a very long time had finally found its place. Olivia had entered their lives as a stranger pulled from the wreckage of a burning airplane. Somewhere along the way, she had become something far more important. She had found the family she never knew she needed, while Ethan and Sophie had found hope after years of loss. As the sun began setting behind the mountains, the three of them sat together on the porch overlooking the valley. The house remained standing. The truth had finally come to light. The people responsible had been held accountable. And for the first time in many years, Ethan felt something he thought he had lost forever. Not relief, not victory, but peace. The plane crash that had once seemed like a terrible tragedy had unexpectedly led them all to a new beginning. And as warm, golden light filled the porch and laughter echoed through the evening air, it became clear that sometimes the greatest miracles are not the lives we save, but the lives that save us in return.